All right, welcome everybody to this video on the Gospel of Mark. You've already watched a few introductory videos on Mark about the authorship and about sort of how Mark begins his gospel in verse 1, talking to the Romans in the city of Rome. But I just want to go into a little bit more of the content of the Gospel of Mark in this video. Just to remind you, in our four Gospels, we want to use kind of a word that reminds us of the theme in each Gospel. With Matthew, it was Jesus as king. He's the king. He is the Jewish Messiah. He is the descendant of David. In Mark, we see that the word is Jesus as servant. Jesus is a servant, and we'll get to that as we get into Mark. In Luke, it's Jesus as Son of Man, because Luke wants to emphasize Jesus' humanity. And then with the Gospel of John, it's Jesus as Son of God, because John wants to emphasize Jesus' divinity. So in the Gospel of Mark, Mark wants to present Jesus as servant. The theme verse is Mark 10, verse 45, where it says, Jesus did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus is a servant in this gospel, and Mark is trying to explain why such a marvelous figure would come to such an untimely end by being crucified on a cross. Well, what Mark wants to do is he wants to convert non-Christians in his gospel despite the shame of the cross, and to say that Jesus, in going to the cross, is actually a servant, and that he's dying intentionally and on purpose and purposefully. So you have this wonder-working Son of God who dies purposefully as a servant to redeem and ransom lost people. And that really is the theme of Mark's gospel. So you already know a little bit about the authorship of this gospel. But just to repeat, John Mark, as he's called, John Mark, reports the preaching of Peter from Rome. So Mark was not an eyewitness to the events he's talking about. He was not one of the 12 disciples. And the source for his information, as you know now, is Peter. Peter was one of the 12 disciples, and so Peter is giving this information to Mark, and then Mark is writing it down, and Mark's audience is in the city of Rome. And his audience is made up mostly of Gentiles. But again, the Gospel of Mark is anonymous. He doesn't put his name on it, but we have very reliable evidence from very early on from some church fathers who make statements about the authorship of this gospel. One of the best statements made on the authorship of Mark is by Papias. Papias was the bishop of Hierapolis, and this is an amazing statement. I won't read the whole thing, but he writes, John and the presbyter, most likely John the Apostle, used to say this. So Papias is quoting from the Apostle John. John lived in the 1st century, Papias in the 2nd. So this is a very reliable source to quote John. He says that Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of the things said or done by the Lord. So just 3 important points to make about Papias's most significant statement here. First of all, of course, he names Mark as the author. Secondly, he says that Mark's source is Peter. He's reporting Peter's preaching. And of course, Peter was an eyewitness to the events of Jesus' life. But then, maybe more importantly, this quote by Papias says that Mark's gospel and the stories that he includes are not in the order of the things that Jesus said or did. That means that Mark did not write in chronological order, in the actual order of how things happened. But Mark is shifting things around and moving his stories to suit his theme, and that he doesn't write chronologically, but he writes rather single points, and then puts them orders them in a thematic way. From the previous video, you already were introduced to who Mark is, and you can see some of those things were also in the video, but notice the very last one on the list. Possible contact with Jesus. Did Mark ever really encounter Jesus? Well, he wasn't one of the 12 disciples, but maybe he did see Jesus once. A tantalizing verse from Mark 14. This is when Jesus is being arrested just before his crucifixion, and it says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Now, what a weird thing to say that is. It doesn't add anything to the narrative. It doesn't move the story forward at all. Why would Mark include this kind of weird note here? Well, I think maybe it's because Mark was actually the one who fled naked when Jesus was being arrested. And he wants to tell his audience that though he wasn't one of the 12 disciples, he did witness something, at least in Jesus' life. So talking about Mark the book, Mark writes his gospel from the city of Rome, and he's writing to Romans in that city who are Gentiles. They're not Christians, they're Gentiles, and that's who Mark is writing to. And a Gentile audience would enjoy drama, action-packed stories. And that's exactly how Mark writes. If you read his gospel, it's very fast-paced. At the very beginning, Mark just jumps right into the story of Jesus as an adult and starts with his baptism. There is no birth narrative in the Gospel of Mark. Very fast-paced stories which would appeal to the Gentile mind. They loved action and they loved drama. And so Mark writes his gospel in exactly that style. In fact, Mark uses the word immediately over 40 times in his gospel. Immediately Jesus did this, and immediately Jesus did that. Jesus is on the move, very action-packed. No long teaching in Mark. No genealogy in Mark like there is in Matthew, because the Gentiles didn't really care about that. They just wanted to get right to the chase and talk about the action. You also heard from one of the previous videos that Mark has a long and a short ending. That is, the earliest manuscripts do not have Mark 16 verses 9 to 20. You know what some of those early manuscripts are. Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus. These are the earliest Greek manuscripts, and they do not have Mark 16, 9 to 20. You can look in your Bibles and probably see a footnote to that effect. Those verses were added later by somebody who probably wanted to give a more satisfying ending to Mark's gospel by writing about some of the resurrection appearances of Jesus. But if you read Mark 16 and just go to verse 8, which was the original gospel, the gospel ends rather abruptly. There you see, the last verse of the gospel would be, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Very abrupt ending. And I think that abrupt ending is intentional because Mark is writing evangelistically and he wants his audience to make a decision for themselves. You've heard the story of what Jesus did. Now make your own decision about that. So the theme of Mark's gospel is really twofold. First of all, in the first half of Mark's gospel, Mark presents Jesus as this wonder-working Son of God. He does miracles all over the place, exhibits his power and authority in many different ways. The very first verse of Mark's gospel is the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In one of the introductory videos that you already watched, you know that that's a sort of a reference to the Roman Caesars in the city of Rome, who would call themselves Divi Filius, which is Latin for Son of God. So Mark's audience was very familiar with the term Son of God, this powerful, authoritative, almost divine-like figure who was a ruler. And so Mark writes to that Roman audience to say, The Caesar is not the Son of God, but I'm about to tell you about the real Son of God. So first of all, Mark presents Jesus as this wonder-working Son of God. So Mark presents Jesus as this wonder-working Son of God in the first half of the gospel, who is this amazing, powerful, greater than the Roman Caesar kind of figure. And that's how he begins the gospel. Then, in the second half of the gospel, Mark presents Jesus as a servant, beginning in chapter 8. But the theme verse is Mark 10:45, where he says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many." And then he presents this Jesus, this wonder-working Son of God, who dies on purpose and intentionally to redeem and ransom human beings. So let me just give a summary of the first part of Mark's theme, Jesus as the wonder-working Son of God. He begins his gospel with Jesus' adult ministry, and first of all shows that Jesus has power in the physical world. One of the outstanding miracles that Jesus does is he feeds many people with just a little bit of bread. Maybe you know the story from Matthew where Jesus uses 5 loaves and 2 fish. Notice this is the way Mark tells that sort of same story, except he says that Jesus took 7 loaves and picked up 7 baskets afterwards and fed 4,000, whereas in Matthew it says he fed 5,000. This is Mark's version of the story. In fact, it's probably another feeding story where here the 7 loaves and the 4,000 represent Gentiles. And so here Mark, whose audience is Gentile, tells a story about Jesus providing food for Gentiles. Secondly, Jesus has power over demons in the Gospel of Mark. This, in fact, is the most frequently recorded miracle in Mark. Jesus casts out demons many times in the Gospel of Mark, and you can read all of these references, but Jesus is casting out demons all over the place, left and right, and it's the most recorded miracle. Here's one example in chapter 5, where Jesus casts out the demon from this man, and says the demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirit came out and went into the pigs. And the herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. So Jesus casts out these demons. Obviously, that would appeal to Mark's audience too in Rome as Gentiles, because they had a high awareness of the spiritual world and the demon world and the power that existed in that kind of world. And here Jesus is showing as the wonder-working Son of God that he has power over the spiritual world and all these demons. There's a little cartoon, if you're interested in that. Remember the swine flu? Well, the swine flu in Jesus' story. Here in Ephesians 6, Paul says that our battle is not just against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and authorities and against powers of this dark world, against spiritual forces of evil. This would be a long conversation, but I think the church and as Christians, we still need to be aware of the power in this spiritual world and the power of Satan in controlling people's lives. And then there are many miracles where Mark portrays Jesus as having power over disease and death. And remember, all of these miracles, this wonder-working Son of God, are recorded in just the first 8 chapters. And so there's a miracle story after miracle story after miracle story. In fact, in the first 8 chapters of Mark, Mark records 19 miracles. If you put all the 4 gospels together, you only read of 35 miracles. Here, Mark records 19 miracles. That's over half of the miracles that Jesus recorded. And since Mark is the shortest gospel, then proportionally speaking, Mark records the most miracles of any other gospel. So in the first half, Jesus is portrayed as the wonder-working Son of God with power in all these different areas. And then in the second half of Mark's gospel, beginning in chapter 8 to 16, he presents Jesus as the servant's son. Of course, this is the main theme of Mark's gospel, to present Jesus as a servant. And beginning in chapter 8, Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to suffer, he's going to die, and that in fact true discipleship involves suffering and service. Here in Mark chapter 8, Jesus says that the Son of Man must suffer many things. And then in chapter 10, we have greatness, Jesus says, is achieved through service. And that's where we get the theme verse. That Jesus is a servant, and he didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom. And so Mark presents Jesus as this servant, accomplishing the will of God, dying on purpose, leaving an empty tomb, purposefully to ransom people. And obviously that picks up on that Old Testament Isaiah 53, where Isaiah presents Jesus as the suffering servant. And that's exactly what Mark does as well. Again, Mark's audience, who are Romans and Gentiles in the city of Rome, who are used to these powerful leader figures like Caesar, they would wonder, why would such a marvelous person like Jesus meet such an untimely end, death by crucifixion? And in the second half of Mark's gospel, or Jesus presents Jesus as a servant, he explains that the reason is because Jesus is dying on purpose as a servant to forgive people's sins. So the purpose that Mark writes his gospel for is that he's writing evangelistically. He's writing to Romans who are Gentiles, who are pagans, who do not know Jesus, who have not made a commitment to Jesus, and he wants to elicit a response. He wants his audience to make a first-time commitment to Jesus. So he presents Jesus as this wonder-working Son of God, this supernatural Son of God who dies on purpose as a servant and leaves an empty tomb. And then he ends his gospel very abruptly. And he says, okay, now, you make a decision. What do you think about this Jesus? So Mark is clearly writing evangelistically to elicit a first-time response of faith to Jesus Christ. So what are some of the unique characteristics of Mark? That is, what are some of the elements in this gospel that only appear in Mark? No other gospel. What is unique to the gospel of Mark? Well, first of all, we can say that Mark is a gospel of brevity. Mark is the shortest of the four gospels, by far. It's very short. Matthew has 28 chapters. Luke has 24 chapters. Mark only has 16. It's very short. It's action-packed. It's straight to the point. It's a short story. It's concise, vivid, and direct. Another unique characteristic is that Mark includes details. He's very vivid, almost like picture writing. And he also writes in kind of a rough grammatical style. Remember, Peter is the source, and Peter would often just speak without thinking, and Mark sort of is recording Peter's style of speech in a very rough sort of style, but very detailed and vivid. For example, Mark includes that Jesus in the boat was sleeping on a cushion. Only Mark includes that detail. He says the whole town gathered at the door. It's a picture of this crowd that none of the other gospel writers include. And then in the feeding of the 5,000, Mark says that they sat down in groups on the green grass, in groups of hundreds and fifties. A very detailed, vivid, almost picture-like expression. Here's an example of Mark's rough language. At one point, people charged Jesus, his family heard about this, and they said he's out of his mind. Well, That's a very rough thing to say about Jesus, and Matthew and Mark do not include that story in theirs. Here's an example of how Mark smooths out some of the, how the other Gospels smooth out some of the rough sayings in the Gospel of Mark. Here in Mark 6, it says that Jesus could not do any miracles. Matthew takes the same story, but changes it a little bit and says he did not do many miracles. Mark seems to suggest that Jesus had an inability to do miracles, whereas Matthew says that rather Jesus had an unwillingness. So the other gospel writers sometimes smooth out the rough sayings of Mark. Another unique characteristic of Mark is that it's a gospel of action. We've already said this. Mark includes 19 miracles in 8 chapters. He uses the word immediately over 40 times. It is action-packed and very fast-paced. And then, fourthly, in Mark's gospel, he emphasizes and highlights the emotions of Jesus. Obviously, that would suit his audience, a Gentile Roman audience who would be used to the dramas and the plays and the theater, the very emotional expressions by actors. And so Mark includes highlights the compassion of Jesus, the anger, the sorrow, the sighing of Jesus. Other gospel writers don't do that. And then of other people and some of their emotions and their reactions to Jesus. Only Mark has this emotional emphasis in his gospel. Fifthly, Mark is a gospel of passion. The Son of God becomes this servant. What an amazing story. What a contrast. And he records this passion narrative of Jesus. Jesus going to the cross from chapter 8 to 16. The entire second half of the gospel is taken up with the passion narrative and the final week of Jesus' life. And then lastly, a unique characteristic of Mark is that he has a very high view of Christ. The demons call Jesus Son of God. The Roman centurion is the very first person to confess his faith in Jesus and identifies him as the Son of God at the cross. The Father calls him Son of God, and Jesus himself claims to be the Son of God. So that's the Gospel of Mark, a gospel of action, a gospel of passion and emotion, a gospel that is evangelistic, written so that the audience and the readers would make a commitment of faith to Jesus Christ, the wonder-working Son of God, who died on purpose as a servant to ransom people back to God.